Hi all. Today we will analyze an interesting situation that happens very often in the opening. Now you will understand what I mean. You play for white. The first move you make with the king's pawn on e4. Your opponent responds with a pawn to e5. You bring the knight to c3. Your opponent puts his knight on f6. You place your light-squared bishop on c4. And your opponent here very often takes the pawn on e4 with his knight in order to remove the central pawn from you. It makes no sense for you to actually take that free horse, since the horse is without protection. Because if you just take it, this standard situation goes further. The pawn on d5 goes further. The pawn is protected by the queen and the pawn makes a fork for the bishop and the knight, and thus winning back a minor piece. Let's say you make the optimal move, take a pawn. Your opponent takes your bishop and all your opponent has a pawn. There were just equal exchanges, that is, you won on a pawn and on a minor piece. But your opponent has the initiative and your opponent has, as it were, captured the center. So again, there is no point in taking this horse. Now I will show you which move you need to actually make so that you have a lot of chances to win. This is a very interesting move and a very correct move, and so we play the same situation. That is, pawns came out. Take your horse out. Your opponent has brought out your horse. You brought the bishop out. Your opponent takes this pawn. I think you have seen this often and you often take this horse. I think you got into such a situation. But you do not take this horse. And you simply move the queen to h5. With this move you created a mating threat on f7, since your queen is attacking the f7 pawn and your dream is attacking the f7 pawn. Now the most interesting thing is that your opponent will need to make some kind of decision. He has three options for avoiding mate. That is, it is either to cover up with a pawn or to put the queen on e7 so that it defends the pawn. Or move the knight to d6 and you just wait. That is, you made a move with your queen and are waiting. That is depending on what level your opponent is playing. And he can make any of these moves and you just have to be able to use it. If your opponent closes himself with a pawn, you simply take the pawn on e5 with the queen check and take the rook on the next move. And the game was won by all your victory. That is, you should of course know this. If your opponent has put the queen on e7, thereby avoiding checkmate as he defended this pawn with the second power, what do? You just can safely take this free knight. It is now really free since there is no longer a pawn move to d5. Since the pawn has no queen defense, the queen has left this file and the pawn can no longer stand on d5. Therefore, after the queen's move to e7, you can safely take this knight. If we consider the variation in principle the most optimal for black. But it is already your opponent who must play at a high level. And he will most likely retreat with his knight to d6. What happens? He defended this pawn with his knight plus he attacked your bishop. After this move, of course, take the bishop to b3, but black has a pawn on e5. Therefore here the knight always moves to c6 to protect the pawn on e5, which is attacked by our queen. You immediately attack this pawn with a second force. That is, the pawn attacked the e5 pawn. Your opponent of course does not have the resources and will not defend this pawn with a second force. And he always takes your pawn here by attacking your knight. What are you doing? You immediately transfer your knight to d5. And here it is very often and you have to wait for this error of your opponent. Your opponent understands that there is a latent mating threat here since both the bishop and the queen are standing here. That's why here very often your opponent puts a pawn on g6. Why does he do it? Since the queen no longer has a move to e5, since the knight is holding this square and the queen can no longer make a check and take the rook. That's why here all your opponent in my practice very often puts a pawn. Because he already wants to drive the queen away from here and thinks that our attacks are no longer there. And we can't give a checkmate. But after this move, if you learn all this, then you have already won the game. After this move you simply withdraw the queen to e2 and check the black king. What options your opponent has? Your opponent only needs to cover himself from this check. They can be closed with either a queen or a knight. Or an elephant. If they are closed with a queen, then you simply take the queen with a knight and you won the game. That is, you agree? I think so. If your opponent closes with a knight, you just check your knight on f6 and checkmate is also very beautiful. I think you agree with that. If your opponent closes with an elephant, what do? You are also a knight on f6 check. The king withdrew the only move. And you bishop on a6 check and checkmate. So I think that from such a simple situation, when you do not take this free horse, do not follow the lead of your opponent so that he captures the center with a pawn and queen. And you do not take the free knight but simply bring the queen to h5. Moreover, even according to any theory, in such a situation this move of the queen to h5 is considered very strong. I think you understand why it starts strong. Since after this move there are a lot of such scenarios in your favor. Because if your opponent doesn't play very well, he doesn't calculate the combinations very well. First of all, his first impulse to push a pawn, you take the rook. The second impulse will be to defend the pawn with the queen. Many do not understand that the horse can already be taken. And if he walked away with a knight here too, you can play very interesting. Moreover, your opponent is acting according to logic. He seems to be making the right moves, but you know this whole combination, knowing this whole trap, if you can call it that. You are completely in control of the game and you know what you are doing. Your opponent will not really understand what is happening, but in the end he will lose. I mean, I think it's worth exploring. I think you will definitely like this. It is very useful. Since this is exactly the knowledge when you see a specific opening. If you see a specific situation, you already clearly know what to do next. This is a real chess understanding, and with such knowledge you can already increase your rating. That is, with such knowledge you can already have a rating even more than 2000, very easy even. And thus winning games. If you liked it, like it, subscribe to the channel. Play chess, and remember, every chess master was once a beginner.